In this video, I'll be talking about an essay called Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evils of Slavery by Ottobah Cugoano in this beautiful edition edited by Mary Antoinette Smith. Cugoano makes the case that slavery is against natural law. He knows that the laws of man permit it currently, but he makes the case that it's against natural law. He calls the piece Thoughts and Sentiments, but I think it skews more toward thoughts than toward sentiments. And as we'll see later, the abolitionist movement was very much entangled with sentimentalism. But I think Cugoano is one of the less sentimental writers who is writing in opposition to the slave trade and slavery itself. So he does depart by other abolitionists also, in that he actually goes into the question of race in some detail. Some of them do that, but not all of them do that. He is focused on liberal principles of universal human rights, which is part of the Enlightenment, but he is using it to apply to slavery. And other slave narratives, other narratives about that are trying to persuade you that slavery is evil, focus often on the feelings of the enslaved person. But and he does some of that. But he also focuses on the question of universal rights. He takes up Enlightenment philosophical questions about how far rights apply. So it's really more of a philosophical essay than a slave narrative or a autobiography. Like we'll read Cugoano later, and his definitely is more of an autobiography or the genre of the slave narrative. He does refer to Christianity, even though he's invested in Enlightenment thought. He refers to Christianity and also to Enlightenment thinking. And his case for Christianity is that just like the members of the Societies for the Reformation of Manners were making the case that with the spread of vice, God is going to strike England down if there's too much vice. He argues that God will not favor England because of the slave trade, and that God will take revenge against the immorality of the practitioners of both slavery and those who trade in slaves. So he does use Christianity somewhat strategically, and he argues that slave revolts themselves are a sign from God that Britons are being punished for slavery. He also turns to Spain as a negative example. Spain, still in the 18th century, was looming large in England's consideration of its own imperial practice. And so he reminds his readers of the Spanish and how they would not want the English to be too much like the Spanish. He says that you cannot read the history of Spanish colonialism without, quote, pity and resentment. So Spain serves as a negative example. So let's talk about the influence of the Enlightenment on Cugoano and his speaking back to the Enlightenment and his engagement with Enlightenment philosophy. He's definitely influenced by Hume and by Adam Smith. It is true, as is widely known right now, that Hume has a footnote saying that the only advanced civilizations in the world are white. So there is evidence of racism in Hume. On the other hand, Hume was opposed to slavery and argued that it was bad for both the enslaver and the enslaved. And this is actually an argument that Adam Smith makes too, that he argues that slavery is a bad system because it crushes creativity, and of course it's bad for the enslaved, but it's also bad for the enslaver. And he also, and this is something that Cugoano calls on, Adam Smith also recorded what we call stadial theory, and his argument was that humanity historically goes through 4 different stages: the age of hunters, the age of shepherds, the age of agriculture, and the age of commerce. And so England, of course, is in the age of commerce. But Cugoano takes that up and he argues that slavery actually belongs to an earlier stage of human development, or it's casting Britons back into a cruder kind of, I want to say civilization, but that's exactly what he's saying, is that they're not being civilized, and that is not a sign of civilization. So he takes Britain's own terms of global stadial history and he argues that the practice of enslavement is dragging them down from being more advanced, which is actually something that Adam Smith agreed with. On the subject of race, he also points to a theory that's called monogenesis. So there were 2 theories about race in the 18th century, monogenesis and polygenesis. And in polygenesis theory, the belief was that people of different races, skin colors, came from different original parents, and there were just different societies developed that came from different origins. But Cugoano argues that everybody comes from the same origin and that there is some human variety, but that human variety is really due to where you live. Like if different areas of the world have different weather systems, and so humans appear in a variety of forms, just like other animals do. Like some big cats are spotted and others aren't, and it doesn't mean they aren't, kind of the same thing. So he argues that humans are all the same. So he's making a case for universal humanity, and it's based on this theory called monogenesis. But then he goes on and says that in a family, it would be wrong for one brother to enslave another brother. So if everybody's part of the same human family, then that makes enslaving anybody wrong, because everybody's part of this human family. So while he relies on Enlightenment theory, as mentioned before, he also folds religion into this. And he actually at one point calls Satan is the great enslaver of men. And so the enslavers and slave traders are the Antichrist in his argument. And so he also argues that both slavery and colonialism are illegal because they're outside the boundaries of civilization, and that when one man enslaves another man, they are not acting according to the laws of civilization, and so it is illegal. And then he goes back and does a little history of slavery in Britain, and he actually expresses his shock and disgust that the slave trade itself in Britain was launched by a king. And he, notes that this is a contradiction because kings are supposed to stand for laws and not engage in this illegal project. And so he casts the whole slavery system as illegal from the beginning. And then he notes that after the Stuart reign, at the end of the 17th century, the slave trade was opened up. And then he argues that lots of very greedy people got into it, and it was an expression of avarice to be engaged in the slave trade. And that now a king could render it illegal, which is what he's encouraging the current government to do, is just make it completely illegal. He also goes and I mean, part of what's missing if you're just reading Cugoano is that it's part of a debate about slavery and whether it's right or wrong, good or bad in the 18th century. And there were certainly people who wrote in a pro-slavery tradition. I know we tend to focus more on the abolitionist literature, which is completely understandable, but there were people who argued for slavery. And one of their arguments, which is actually something that we saw earlier in this semester, is that the argument is that there has always been slavery, that for humans there's always been, you can find it in the Bible, You can find it in the Ottoman Empire. You can find it in lots of different cultures. And so, because there's always been slavery, it's just kind of a natural way of how humans are organized. So that was one of the arguments defending slavery in the 18th century. Cugoano takes it up, and he says, yes, there's always been servitude, and he even argues that that some kind of servitude is necessary in human society. But he says that there's never been anything like the African trade, which is cruel and brutal, and it transgresses all the laws of God and civilization. And he also makes the interesting case that in the African trade, all slaves have been obtained illegally. And so, turning to the Lockean concept that everybody owns their own body, if you are kidnapped into slavery, that is refusing you your right of ownership over your body. And so all slaves, I mean, nobody volunteered to be a slave in the African slave trade of the 17th and 18th century. So all of these slaves, every single person who's enslaved was obtained illegally, was kidnapped in an act of violence. And so this act of violence of kidnapping is already outside of the laws of civilization. And so nobody who's enslaved is enslaved legally. And so you'll notice that Cugoano posits a kind of universal law that transcends individual moments of history in which there are different laws. So of course, a king's responsibility is to uphold this universal law, he argues. But as he also points out, Charles II was the one who started this slave trade for Britain and actually profited from it. So he is appealing to Britons later to dismiss that immorality, which is actually kind of, Charles II had a bad reputation for other things as well, and many people in the 18th century would have agreed that he was not a model of morality. So it is interesting because Cugoano is proposing that even a king can act illegally. So he has no acceptance of the theory of absolutism, which would say that if the king does it, then it's fine and the king is above the law. For Cugoano, there's a universal law that is related to Christianity, but not necessarily dependent on it, because it's also related to these Enlightenment thinkers like Adam Smith and David Hume, who are looking at a kind of evolution of civilization and making arguments for a kind of universal rules of civilization. And he argues that not only is all slaving illegal, all of the 18th century slave trade illegal because everyone in it has been kidnapped, he argues that that slavery has never seen the kind of hardships and cruelty that it does now. Although it now being when he's writing. Although it is interesting compared to other discussions of slavery that again, like, there are more thoughts, I think, than sentiments in this essay, that he doesn't really rely on feeling. He relies on Enlightenment philosophy to make this point. And so his argument is that ships of war should be immediately dispatched to the coast of Africa to prevent any more acquisition of enslaved people.